Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast. To our listeners and viewers around the world, in these pivotal times, we feel it's vital to engage in meaningful dialogue about Palestine, to provide deeper insights, some context, and to highlight Palestine's rich traditions, history, and culture, which is something that is not often reflected in mainstream legacy media. We are also recording this right after International Women's Day, and we wanted to take a moment for us all to remember the women of Palestine. Not just the unconscionable murder and wholesale death in Gaza, where civilians generally, women, men, and children, have been killed in an ongoing genocide, but also all the women who survive all over Palestine and deal with the loss, the death of their children, children who've been maimed, children who've been shot, children who are currently being held without charge and often tortured in administrative detention. And those women who've had their homes taken, their homes blown up, stolen, but still somehow managed to get up each day and hold together their families, hold together their connection with the land, and exhibit this incredible sumud, or resistance, that we know so well from Palestinians. I'm really thrilled today that we have a woman, a special guest, a very dear friend of ours, Farah Nabulsi, who is here to talk about the importance of Palestinian representation through film. So obviously this is a topic very close to Hanan and our hearts, and also to talk about Palestine and the quest for a just solution. Farah is a Palestinian. She's Oscar-nominated. She's a BAFTA award-winning filmmaker and human rights advocate. We're absolutely thrilled to have her with us today. Farah, welcome.
Hi, great to be here.
Hi, Farah, ahlan and welcome. And if we may, let's dive in and start by talking about your parents, your grandparents, how they were affected by the 67 Naksa when the Zionist colony of Israel illegitimately occupied the rest of the Palestine, displacing and ethnically cleansing over 300,000 Palestinians, and also which was a continuation of the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe that displaced and ethnically cleansed over 750,000 Palestinians, including my mom's family from West Jerusalem. So I'd love to hear about your family's history in Palestine and that led up to the expulsion.
Yeah, look, from my mom's point of view, she was born and raised in Palestine, from Nablus, and the story I've understood from her was in 1967, she was actually visiting Lebanon, like on holiday, for a few days. And then, they call the war, but I mean, yeah, we know it was hardly a war. The Naksa happened, as it were, and she was told, "Don't come back." In those few days, it was like, "No, don't come back. We don't know what's happening. Head to Kuwait." And so she ended up going to Kuwait, and then at some point, various other members of her family joined her. Her mother and father remained in Nablus, um, and yeah, and that was it. And then she headed to London after that. So, is she a direct refugee in that moment? No, in that sense. But when we talk about Palestinians in diaspora, I remember when I met Hanan Ashrawi for the first time, and we were discussing things, and she used the word exile. And this is a very interesting word that I don't think we use enough, and I think it is actually the better description of so many Palestinians out in the world. I'm talking about beyond the refugee camps. So anyway, that was my mom, and she met my father in the UK, in London. My father, on the other hand, was born in Egypt, so he's Palestinian origin. And it's interestingly, recently, my father was telling me about his father working in a refugee camp in Jordan as a doctor for refugees in 1949 on the back of 1948 expulsions. And so, interesting connection there. But my actual father was born in Egypt, and he also ended up then in Kuwait and went to London and met my mother. So it's not your tip. We had the privilege, as it were. My father went to study in the UK. He was doing his PhD, and my mother went to the UK to learn, sorry, not to learn, to work, So it's not direct, but at the end of the day, did they have somewhere to go back to at will and flourish? No. So that's the background of my parents.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it is an exile, as you say. It's unfortunately not a choice, but an existence, if you like. But Farah, after a successful career in finance, you pivoted and you became a filmmaker after your first visit to Palestine in 2013. So what influenced the significant change in your trajectory and sort of completely moving away into film production and film creation?
Well, I mean, it wasn't immediate, and it's crazy because I had been to Palestine as a child a number of times. Around the first Intifada in 1988, we stopped going, and then 25 years later, around 2013 and 2014, I go back for the first time as an adult. And I'm somebody who really did think that, she'd understood to an extent, the reality, what's been going on, occupation, colonization, all of this. But I was really hit very hard by what I was witnessing firsthand, whether it was, the refugee camps, whether it was meeting with mothers whose teenage boys had been taken away in the middle of the night, whether it was the wall plowing between Palestinian homes and lands and villages and towns, and the checkpoints, the watchtowers, the separate road systems. The settlements specifically was very, very bizarre because I'd seen those maps. I knew, what was going on there, but to look up at the hilltops and not at first know what they were. I'd be like, so what's that? And they're like, no, that's a settlement. I'm like, wait, this is insane because there's the Palestinian village and there's a Palestinian, and it was like, it became so real. And the injustice was just so colossal. And so it wasn't just this one trip. What happened was then I sort of almost had a bit of a bug where I'd gotten over the stigma of going there. And I went back and forth almost every other month for a little bit. Like I needed to know more. I needed to see more. I needed to meet more people. I needed to understand more. Of course, I have family there as well. And I was overwhelmed, really, to the point that I was writing therapeutically about what I had seen and felt, and even began to sort of imagine as I practiced empathy. Just natural empathy of if this was me or this, and it took about 2 years of racking my brains, really verging on depression, I would say even, where what in Arabic, as you say, ala addi, to my capabilities or my size or my, what could I do? And at the same time, I'd always loved film and cinema, theater, drama. And I felt this very sort of deep desire to tell the stories of these people I had met that I felt connected to somehow by way of identity, by my blood, by my roots, by my parents, whatever it was. And I remember at the time reading an art critic who said, you cannot make art without a sense of identity, yet it is identity we seek in making art. And that at the time, it was like, it resonated with me. It was like, I am getting to know myself more as a human being. And at the same time, I guess through the art, I would get to know myself more, but vice versa, the art would, it just made sense to me. Like, okay, I'm feeling this pull towards something. And so I kind of decided, first I looked at this idea of audio pieces, because it's very powerful, the sense of sound and hearing and listening. And I played with the idea of audio pieces. And then, and I also had, sorry, I'm all over the place here because I was going through quite a lot of like aha moments where I looked at sort of NGOs. I was looking at charity. I was looking at the BDS movement. All these things seem to exist in this ecosystem of freeing Palestine and ending this injustice and this oppression. But there was something that I felt was missing in the sense of engagement. Like, why has this been allowed to go on for so long on such a scale? Even if there is right and international law and all the truths and proofs and human rights law and all of this is there, what's going on? And it was this realization that there is not enough empathy, understanding, this severe dehumanization that has been taking place. It all became very, very clear. And I thought, well, these pieces I have, they do something emotionally, even to me when I reread them, as it were. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try something here. So it was very experimental initially. And I sort of began recording these audio pieces. And I thought, well, hold on, I love film, I love cinema. I think of all the art forms, that cinema really has the power to penetrate beyond. I mean, it's the most powerful means of meaningful human communication, to be honest, that the world has ever known. And at the same time, it can travel. So as much as I love theater and I contemplated, it was like, but film can really transcend borders quite literally because of technology and all of that. And I thought, okay, so there's two things going on here. I want to express myself creatively. I want to tell these stories. And at the same time, film, cinema is what I'm attracted to. And it seems to be, even from a practical point of view, little did I know how difficult it all was, to sort of get these stories out there. And I just kind of went, all right, I'm going to try and adapt some of these writings that were never intended for film into these short films. And I'm going to see what happens. And I didn't tell anyone, to be honest, nobody except maybe my husband and maybe one friend or something at some point. So I've gone off track here, but so what it was is I went home, and that was a huge shift for me in terms of how I perceived my own identity, the Palestinian catastrophe, the Palestinian struggle. It was hugely eye-opening, and realizing that I can't bring the world to Palestine as much as I'd like to. I'd like to physically. I mean, that's, in many ways, you could say, the Zionist birthright, initiative, where you have billionaires funding, Jewish people from anywhere in the world, regardless of where they're born, what their background, their heritage, saying, yes, come, free trip to Palestine or to Israel, and they're, in their vocabulary and their understanding of it. And it's like, oh, let's get them there so that there's that connection that they then manufacture. And here I was experiencing a very natural kind of return to home and connecting. And I thought, wow, if I could bring everyone there. I even did the maths, guys. Like I literally was sort of going, okay, just so I could understand. I mean, again, my investment banking background was like,
your finance background.
So if I took 2 million people, every year for 3 weeks, blah, blah, like free trips for all, of course, it was like some ridiculous in the billions and billions. And at the same time, you need the people to want to go there. You need them to actually say, well, I can give up 2-3 weeks of my life. Yeah. It's a massive project, which ala addi, to my size, my capabilities, I could not do, right? So I'm not, I don't want to, use them as the example, but I'm not Sheldon Adelson or Haim Shaban, Palestinian version, it wasn't going to happen.
But it's great that you could take Palestine to the world. I love that.
Absolutely. That. So that was I said, what's the next best thing I could do? I could bring Palestine to the people somehow or another in what I feel is, potentially the most effective way and as wide as possible. And, there is nothing more powerful than getting people in a room, in a dark, quiet room I mean, in the end, obviously the present was 24 minutes, and it was the short films I adapted was different, 7 minutes there. But, for 2 hours to be able to really, like with the teacher, bring the lived Palestinian experience and Palestine, the beauty and the ugliness and the oppression, but also the aliveness, all of it to audiences and really connect them with this place far, far away. Wow, that's something for far, 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 far lower budget than, than shipping, So it was practical and pragmatic on the one hand, the thought process, and on the other hand, it was in a private, and I don't want to call it a selfish way, but to an extent, Farah expressing herself creatively and a release, an outlet, a conduit for this depression, for this pain, for this. I was appalled. I still am. That's why I have to continue creating, because I think without it, I'm going insane, or I want to tear my hair out. So it's also it's my own personal therapy still. It's cathartic, and to be honest, I feel like I'm in the business of alchemy, not necessarily filmmaking. I don't see it as, it's like a form of alchemy where I'm taking that anger, that outrage, that so I said grief, and I'm trying to, turn it into something inspiring, something that affects change, that can take audiences into this world, this emotional journey that's, can shift perspective, can do something bigger and better than that original outrage and pain and grief. And there's something, and that's what, art can do, actually.
And it's also that it was it was interesting that you said you knew all about it logically. You've looked at the maps, the settlements, but until you're there experiencing the human story of it, and for us, that's why representation is always so important in storytelling, as a novelist and filmmaker. I feel the same way, because when you're watching a movie, you're watching one person's experience. And it's not about trying to make that everybody's experience, but it's much easier to digest a concept like oppression or occupation when you are taken into the emotional life of somebody. So for me, I think that's why representation is so important. We'll talk about your films individually in a minute, but that representation is key, I think. I think you probably agree.
Absolutely, I agree. And it's always frustrating when people sort of turn around sometimes. And of course, with Palestinian films, it's like, oh, but it's not balanced. And you're like, what? Cinema, it's a film. Show me any single film. You have a POV, and in my case, sometimes I have various characters and they're like, oh, but why didn't you focus on this? Or why didn't you? And it's like, but I've chosen who I'm focusing on, and that's my prerogative.
You carry a lot of weight as a filmmaker of the world on your shoulders in a way. But I don't think the birthright tours are typically balanced, because they don't go to Palestinian homes or refugee camps. So
absolutely not. But you think in cinema people would understand that in film, like that. But it's number one. I'd say, of course, it has to be informed, whatever you're doing. So if we're talking about film and art, and it has to be informed. And of course, who's more informed about their own reality in many ways than Palestinians themselves, in that sense of so let us represent ourselves. Now, obviously, there are different Palestinians who say, oh, you're not a Palestinian who's lived in Palestine. You're a Palestinian who's not from a refugee, but you're a Palestinian who lives in America. But you're Palestinians, let us tell our stories and represent in that sense. And the fact is, our narrative has been hijacked for so long, really, and on such a scale. And so, at the end of the day, we have to go through that by representing our stories. We are reclaiming that narrative, right? And that's it's not just that we've been, there's been misperceptions or there's been disinformation.
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean? Like deliberate manipulation of our stories and our narratives. And you look at, Hollywood is a perfect example of how even like the Arab Palestinian or even the kufiyya has been projected, out into the world. And you think, of course, I mean, Palestinian representation is key to all of this, actually.
Completely.
Because of that manipulation of whether it's in cinema or media or, the stories or, the narrative, basically, that's been hijacked. So, yeah, I absolutely agree.
And Farah, speaking of narrative, I mean, the Zionist narrative of a land without a people for a people without a land is used again and again to erase centuries of our rich indigenous Palestinian culture and history. And it hasn't stopped, as we see. This mindset persists, whether it's in Hollywood, whether it's through media. And now we're seeing it through the illegal suggestion of removing Palestinians out of Gaza, which is really ethnic cleansing. So can you just talk a bit more about the importance of countering this propaganda of a land without a people and erasing our indigenous Palestinian heritage?
Yeah. It's funny because I feel like that was something they tried to sell internally, externally, wherever they could go so that they could carry out what they were going to carry out, right? And back then, you didn't have the media the way it is today. You didn't have social media, you didn't have transatlantic media, you didn't have any of alternative media. You didn't have access, right? So you just took what you were told, and then maybe someone would bother to look up, what did this person who visited that land say, if you could be bothered. Most people couldn't even read, if you think about it. So they've been perpetrating this thing, but anyone can see, anyone with half a brain and eyes that want to see can see it was a land with a people. And it's one of the most, that's why this has been such a massive, like I said, we'll use the word conflict right now, but such a massive issue for decades. If there was no one there, then there wouldn't have been a problem, right? So I think, to be honest, it's not necessarily countering that anymore in the sense that I think it's so clear and obvious, especially when you have people using words like Nakba and Naksa far more widespread than ever before. That means they've understood like the concept of the ethnic cleansing of over 750,000 Palestinians, back in 1948 and what took place in 1967, and that the 6 million refugees plus in squalid refugee camps in around Palestine, inside Palestine, even Gaza now, we say the majority of the people in Gaza are actually refugees, second, third time refugees even. So but what it is remembering this. When we say that colonizers throughout history go through this process, all colonizers, not just settler colonists of Israel, but like all colonists or Zionists, is this process of dehumanization, then branding those they are colonizing as barbarians and terrorists, and then denying they ever existed. And it's almost like the three stages, that the third stage was attempted, back then, saying it's a land without a people, for people without a land, but a land without people, as if they don't exist, right? So really what it is countering all those elements, unfortunately, to say, well, hold on, first of all, the dehumanization, reverse that, we shouldn't have to do this. It's ridiculous, but that is the case, unfortunately. And then this branding of barbarians, terrorists, well, the more people can understand the struggle, then they realize, like, hold on, this isn't baseless hatefulness. This is resistance to decades-long occupation. It's rejection of apartheid. It's a resistance to the checkpoints, to the control systems, to the oppression, and so forth, right? And this idea of, okay, they never existed. Well, hold on. Here's our culture. Here's our history. Here are our poets and our writers and our and the beautiful thing is, Palestinians are the descendants of all the indigenous people who ever lived on that land. So we can go back and say, well, what do you mean we didn't exist? The people there are the people who have, been there for generations and generations. Yes, people have come and gone, but still, that's what it is. So I think, and that, of course, through culture so I think it's not kind of looking at the one thing of a land without a people. I think that's just kind of in many ways old news. It's about now making sure that they cannot try to disappear us. They've already done the first two phases, and we're fighting against that. We have to, which is why sometimes when I'm pitching for funding for the films and stuff, I kind of make it a point for those who are Palestinian or is like, even if we go down in flames, let these films be the legacy, let them be serving to preserve our history and memory, and provide that at the very least, that no, there was a people here regardless of what they might be trying to, and we see what they're trying to, the end game is.
Absolutely. And not only that, I mean, the Zionist settler colony of Israel was founded through the violent dispossession, systematic expulsion, as you say, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So it wasn't an empty land per se. It's been centuries. But we've endured since that settler colonial state, we've endured decades of brutal, cruel oppression, illegal occupation, but we haven't been crushed. And in your first project, Oceans of Injustice, you highlight, if you like, the suffering of this injustice. I think Noam Chomsky also talked about the courage of your film and the courage of the Palestinians and their endless suffering. So could you discuss the themes of this particular film and your process and how it links to Palestinian sumud and resistance, and how that resistance will never stop, if you like? Too many questions, I know, but...
I mean, I'll just talk about Oceans of Injustice, I think, and hopefully we'll somehow touch on all those elements. So bear in mind, Oceans of Injustice was the first short film I adapted, so from my writing, so wrote and produced. And at the time, I can be honest with you, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. What I did know is what I was feeling. And it was a very autobiographical short film, in the sense of it's my story. We think we know, and we think we feel with them, and we think we understand the injustice because we've read some book, or so not so biased or quite so censored article, or because we heard from a friend, or we watched a YouTube video. But there is so much more. We have merely dipped our toes into the gentle tide of this colossal injustice. And it's this, and those are the opening lines. And this is me. It's like, I thought I knew, I thought I understood. I'd read the books, I'd watched the videos. So it's that journey. And I hired a director, and, he understood very much where I was coming from, to the point that he insisted I would be in the film, as opposed to, kind of nudging him, doing this and let's do that and whatever. But to be in it, we tried to cast. There's the lady on the beach. That's me. And he said, Farah, you really, really feel this. This is your story. I really insist you should be in it. And in the end, I conceded, and I was like, okay, fine, and did it. And once you step into the ocean, which is what happens in the film, we go down, down, down. And this is where there's a lot of imagery that's real from Palestine. And it's juxtaposed with people literally drowning in water. They're fighting, they're struggling in it. It's kind of, so it's experimental in this way. And it's the struggle, this idea of, keeping your head above the rising tide of degradation. That's what Palestine seemed to me, this idea of you're constantly struggling. To me, it's like you've taken an entire population of people, generations of people, and they're just in constant struggle. And that's like, and when I say struggle, it's like you're constantly avoiding drowning. I mean, I just can't imagine that kind of existence. And that's what this film was about. It was, but you see the determination in these people in the film, and we talk about. I say talk about, like, it's voiceover again. This is an adaptation, and it's kind of like tone poem, and for me, that's just an introduction. I didn't even submit that film to festivals. I didn't, it was just me expressing myself, but hopefully representing what I perceive to be the more abstract version of the struggle, juxtaposed with real life imagery of the decades, whether it's old pictures from the refugee camps or um, famous images of, a child with a soldier pointing a gun at the child's head, or, really bringing in some visceral imagery juxtaposed with this abstract or, symbolic struggle in the water of these characters. And it has a visceral impact on all the people who've watched it. I mean, I remember the first time I showed it to an audience, and there was not a dry eye. I remember even at one point, so later, as my films got out in the world, then I would screen my 3 short films before I'd even made the present at universities and screening events and things like that. I remember a teacher in the States, in America, no affiliation to with Palestine, no affiliation to anything like that. And sorry, I'm really going off track here, but her reaction at one point, she says, "I don't know how to swim." And that analogy killed me. She was like, watching those people in the water struggling. It was like you'd given me something that I could relate to, despite the images and all of that, which is horrible. I could see that's wrong, and a child shouldn't have a gun pulled to their head, and why are these refugees? And she goes, and I could feel it all. I could see it. She goes, but just being able to connect with the idea of avoiding drowning. So just that analogy had transcended in a way that was so powerful. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that I started to realize the power of cinema, like really realize it beyond what I, again, practically thought. Oh, yes, they can do this, they can do that. I'm seeing it and I'm like, wow. So anyway, so Oceans of Injustice, I can't remember what the rest of the questions were.
No, don't worry. I think you very eloquently answered it. And let's also talk a bit about your other film, Today They Took My Son, where you delve into the brutal treatment of Palestinian children. And this project, it remains today even as relevant as it was then. So could you just elaborate on that and how this came about and what your message was?
Yeah, so I'd come across this report. It was a UN report, and it documented how, thousands of children since 2000. So of course, if we go prior to 2000, it's even more thousands of children. But this was a report that was written that led up to approximately 2014 at the time, or something like that, 2014, where over 7,000 Palestinian children had gone through this process of, being put through Israeli military detention. And I remember reading this report and just, again, being blown away. What the hell is this? And I'm a mother. And again, I wasn't a filmmaker when I wrote this. Of course, like I said, I'd met these mothers who told me about their children being taken away in the middle of the night. They were telling me about how, I distinctly remember one mother telling me she's tried several times to just get a jacket, to her son, who was 14 years old, to keep him warm in the winter months. And they had refused her again and again. And she does the trip to go. And where these kids are being held as well, because again, it's illegal to take them inside historic Palestine into those prisons, which they do, which makes it, of course, nearly impossible for their parents to visit. And, and the fact that there's no lawyers. And so it's the concept of administrative detention, which you mentioned right at the start, but, without trial or charge of these teenagers. It's crazy. The whole thing is just crazy. And so again, I just wrote this piece. I imagined myself as a mother, and I am a mother, so I was a mother at the time, but as a mother in Palestine, whose child is taken away. Like, what does that feel like? What is that? What are you going through? And I wrote it again, not knowing that I was going to make this into a film. So, bear that in mind. But then I thought, well, hold on, let me try and adapt this. And when I did, again, hired a director, discussed, many, many things. And in the process of all of this, I'm always asked, why didn't you direct? Why did you direct the people on the set? Because I'm obviously very keen artistically and involved. And kind of worked with him, Pierre Dawalibi. He had a beautiful vision of this whole juxtaposition with the pictures, again, and imagery of real Palestinian children being taken away and arrested and so forth. And we have this 7-minute film. And so I thought, I'm going to submit this to festivals. And the response was fantastic. And some pretty impressive festivals got back and programmed the film. And I remember being at my first sort of Q&As in front of festival audiences, and you know how with short films, they're programmed amongst other short films. And I would be standing on the stage, and so many people were directing the questions to me. I was almost embarrassed sometimes for the other filmmakers, like, well, it's because, and it proved to me, again, people are interested, people are curious, people are confused, people are shocked. They want to know. They would be asking me, so, sorry, what's going on here? Why are they taking these children? And wait, but where is this exactly? And how? And you realize, as much as we think so many people know, they don't know.
No, they don't.
There are many who do, don't get me wrong. They don't know. And even then, but did you feel?
Yeah.
And if you don't feel, it's only going to go so far,
Yeah.
right? So that was, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry.
No. So that was it. So that was the second film. Now, when we talk about today, the crazy thing is, I mean, the amount of people and children who have been arrested, have been, processed through Israeli military detention, has been increasing, and of course, in this past year and a half, exponentially so. And it's shocking to me that, this is something I wrote in, 2014, and 10 years later, here we are. And it's been going on for decades. And it's obviously against the Convention of Rights of Children. All these sort of major human rights organizations have spoken about it, written about it. They know it's wrong, and it's still happening. So, this again is a film that in the last year and a half, it's been screening, and people kind of have used it as a tool. It was shared by people in universities, in various kind of government scenarios. I screened the film in front of the United Nations in the Trustee Council chamber, along with my other short films, again, prior to the present, and addressed the council, pointing this out. This is your UN report, and here's the 7-minute film. Hopefully you'll feel something as opposed to just understand the statistics and the numbers and the,
I think it's really interesting that you say, like, and I think one of the reasons Hanan and I started this podcast was that there is this lack of knowledge. I mean, people just have what they get from mainstream legacy media, and we know that's kind of basic and it's skewed, and Palestinians come off as terrorists or refugees, and in the poorest way, nothing in between.
Or like they understand in broad strokes. Oh, okay, so it's, there's a conflict there, and they're fighting for land, or, okay, some might be like, okay, it's an occupation, but they don't. It's like these words, occupation, even apartheid. I mean, they don't realize the inherent violence that comes with that. The details, which actually is sorry, just to go back for a second to Oceans of Injustice. Both of them. So when I had these two films and Nightmare Gaza as well, and this realization that these festivals and the Q&As and all this, I thought, wait, the half an hour is not enough and all this. So I ended up creating this website, which was named after the first film, Oceans of Injustice. And it was me saying, right, I need to deconstruct what this means, what occupation means, so that people can understand it. It's like, it's even control of water. It's the separate road system, the apartheid system. It's denial of education. It's the control of freedom of movement. It's the permit systems. There's so much that comes under that, and all the humiliation that comes with that, all the degradation, and all the violence that comes with that. So when we use these bigger words, people don't really connect it with what it means literally, physically, in terms of children being dragged away in the middle of the night, or kneecaps being blown off at protests, or mothers giving birth at checkpoints, or executions, so if they don't understand all of that, then actually when things like October 7 happen, they're seeing a violence and they're having no kind of real understanding that there's been decades of violence for 70 years perpetrated by the occupier, by the colonizer, towards the occupied and the colonized.
Yeah.
It's so anyway.
Well, it doesn't get the same airspace. And you mentioned Nightmare in Gaza, which I think it was in 2018, which is a really haunting film, but it explores the systematic bombings and killings of Palestinians in Gaza, which people again think happened after October 7th.
Yeah, but the crazy thing is, I wrote that one not in 2018. It only manifested in a visual, very experimental film, or abstract film, in 2018. But I wrote it in 2014. Again, wasn't in film. I remember the summer of 2014, the bombs are dropping on Gaza, the numbers of the children being killed, which now is like a drop. It's crazy to me that those numbers seem so large and so terrible, and it's just a drop now in the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been killed, including the thousands and thousands and thousands of children who have been killed in this last year and a half, in this genocide. But back then, I was my head, I couldn't get over, 12 more children, 20 more children, 30 more children. Of course, it culminated in approximately 500 Palestinian children in Gaza being killed, and I think it was 2,000 adults, and 2,500 people was huge. And it was so terrible. And I remember being stuck on social media and the news. And I remember writing this piece in Spain as my children were playing in a swimming pool, and I just couldn't focus with them. And bawling my eyes out, wrote Nightmare of Gaza again as a mother, in this scenario. And yet I've re-released, I mean, it's there, the film is out there for anyone to see. We're talking 10 years ago, 10 years plus, written. And it could have been written yesterday. And you could listen to it. And if I told you I wrote it a week ago, 2 weeks, whatever, you would have gone, yeah, 10 years on, exactly.
Yeah, and as you say, Farah, also this kind of numbering, so many numbers, they dehumanize us versus humanizing. These are lives lived of people, of children, of mothers, and also another thing that people don't know about is this prohibition of public joy and emotional display. It's viewed as a threat because it humanizes Palestinians. We're seeing it now as they're releasing more and more of those people, of the Palestinians who were unjustly held under the administrative detention that you talk about. But like everyone else, Palestinians have the right to freedom, to express their joy, their emotions. And this racist narrative of dehumanizing us, it's a worldview, and it really needs to change. And we all have to play a part in this change, because by bringing, like you said, specific stories, people, and not just numbers, not reducing Palestinians to numbers, it's really important in bringing our humanity, that we are like everyone else.
I wanted to ask you, Farah, on that note about the present, because that was like, I think, a shift from writing and producing films, as we've been talking about up till now, to directing. And the present was really wonderful. Hanan and I got to attend the premiere. You know, we voted for it for BAFTA. And, you know, we highly recommend it to anybody, all of these films. As you know, my parents are Indians from South Africa. They left because of apartheid. The present very much touches on Israeli-Palestinian apartheid. And tell us, what were the challenges for you? We can talk about the apartheid of it, of course, but I'm interested in what were the challenges moving from producing to directing.
And sorry, just to add, it also received an Oscar nomination for our audience.
That's my bad. It received an Oscar nomination, very well deserved.
Yeah.
You know, it's a strange one because, of course, I mean, I wrote the story as well, co-wrote the script because there was a little bit of imposter syndrome because this was not an adaptation from one of these personal therapeutic writings. I was already in the film industry at this point. I've got the bug. I love what I'm doing. You know, people are saying, well, Farah, anyone who knew you as a teenager knows you're exactly where you're supposed to be now. You know, so it's come kind of full circle, if you like, in some ways to maybe where I'm supposed to be, and I still, you know, produced as well. But the question was throughout the first 3 short films was, why aren't you directing? Why aren't you directing? And I said, because I haven't been to film school. I don't know. I don't know the technicals. I don't, you know, and of course I've been on the sets of the other films and been taking it all in. And you know, everyone would say to me, no, you just have to have really the vision of what it is you want to achieve. Surround yourself, obviously, with the people who can help you execute that. And you know, be able to lead and you know, and I remember even at this point thinking to myself, okay, the present, I can see very clearly in my mind's eye the whole world of the film, you know, and I felt so passionately about this story. And I remember even getting in touch with a friend of mine, she's a director, film director. And I was like, so I'm thinking of directing this film, but I've heard of the concept of co-directors. So she read the script page. She came back, she goes, Farah, I've known you a number of years now. You don't need to co-direct this with anyone. You can direct it. You're good. Go ahead, do it. You know, she kind of gave me this kind of, you know, don't be afraid kind of thing. And so I did. And the challenges were huge. I mean, you know, I was a fish out of water the entire time, of course. I remember even on the first day for the first take of the first scene, despite having, you know, read up and you know, okay, grabbing my production designer and going, okay, I just need you to remind me, like, when do I say action? Like, I've been on sets, I've witnessed it, I've even read, like, I've even Googled it, you know, okay, but still, like, here I am. I just need to be absolutely sure I don't make a fool of myself, you know, at the same time. It's like, okay, so, you know, camera, this, set, okay, you know, or, you know, like, I'm learning on the job. And I think it was Stanley Kubrick who said the best education in film is to make one. I am like the poster picture of that, because quite literally I had never directed a single thing before that. And here I am in Palestine directing my first film. And you know, I'd be like, okay, I'd be telling my cinematographer, okay, so I want the camera to do the, you know, where it moves across, and they're like, okay, you know, you're tracking. I'm like, okay, that's the word, you know, writing it on my hand, like knowing what I wanted and being able to communicate it. That was really the key element, be able to communicate it with the team. And I'd say that I also, from my background, my sort of business background, banking background, that served me well, because as you know, like in independent cinema, you're wearing so many different hats. You have to be, you know, I'm not saying every director has to be that way, but in my case, I was wearing all these different hats. I'd come out of nowhere and I'm like, oh, I'm directing this film. And so whether it was being mindful of the budgets, not being intimidated by certain things, being able to pitch in the first place to raise the funds to make this film, these things seem to come together to serve me well. Yeah. And, you know, so I'm grateful for that. But it was, at the time, I thought it was the hardest thing I had ever had to do until I made a feature film. And
Yeah,
then
which we'll
I
talk,
was like,
which we'll talk about. You know, I
yeah.
mean, Shamim and I had the same experience on our first feature, which is I Can't Think Straight, where it was her first time directing, my first time producing. So we feel your
Our
pain.
first time on a set, let's even say
And the
that.
first time is exactly. But
Oh,
Farah,
really?
yeah,
I got to hear about that soon.
yeah, we will over coffee or a meal. But Farah, the teacher, your first feature film, since you mentioned it, which premiered not long ago at TIFF, at Toronto Film Festival in 2023. Again, Shamim and I attended your premiere with our sons, Ethan and Luca. It was really a beautiful film. Anyone who hasn't seen it, listening to or watching our podcast, please do. And you won many international awards. It was longlisted for BAFTA for Outstanding Debut in 2024. So really, it's a wonderful and very big film, as you say. And we'd love you to talk about the themes, the experience of working. Well, you worked with Saleh Bakri, who's a renowned Palestinian actor, but also with Imogen Poots and others. And I know Shamim is always interested in the second question, which is about your filming process, the challenges of making your first feature. So altogether, lots of questions, but would love to hear more.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that, of course, with Saleh Bakri, I'd already worked with him on The Present, right?
That's right. That's right.
And I think, and I don't know if you have worked with the same actors more than once, but I'm sure you would agree, and it seems logical that if you do, you get to know those actors better and better, and how they like to work, and you know, whether it's in the preferences for preps and the set environment and your approach and the kind of language you know, and so that's definitely the case in the sense of, like, you know, worked with Saleh. I'm not saying it was all smooth and, you know, roses, no, but we did something beautiful together, and it worked, and it was powerful, and it was, you know, and for me, when I had the teacher, before I'd even written the first draft, I knew the whole story in my head. I've done my kind of story notes of, like, what the story is, but I never even verbalized it to anyone. And I ended up telling him the story verbally for the first time that I'd ever even verbalized it. And he listened to the whole thing, and he's like, yeah, it's good. It sounds good. And I was like, yeah, because you're going to be the teacher. And he's like, yeah, okay, great. And then that was it. So, you know, he was on board, and we had worked together before. So it was khalas, you know, done. Whereas, you know, with Imogen Poots and the other sort of international actors, that was a matter of, yes, casting, using a casting director in you know, in the UK, and really trying to find the right person, and somebody who's willing, and the people, including Stanley Townsend and Andrea Irvine and Paul Hertzberg, who all came to Palestine, being willing to come to Palestine, to this unknown place to them that has all sorts of you know, stigmas attached to it, and the unknown, and come and make this film. And they all did, and it was all on the back of, you know, a screenplay. And so it just reminds you how important a story is and a screenplay is to really inspire and entice good actors to want to come and take a chance with you on your first feature film. And working with someone like Saleh Bakri, who is a seasoned actor, and you know, they could see his body of work, and the fact that Saleh and I had you know, accomplished something great with The Present. Do you know what I mean? So that all worked out well. But what I've realized, and then of course you have Adam, the character of Adam, who is Mohammed Abdurrahman, who had never, you know, he was new to acting, and so he has a different approach, and he's more raw, but extremely talented. And what I've realized, honestly, is actors really are not a monolith, and you know, you have to love them and appreciate them, and you as the director have to be the chameleon, actually, and adapt and shapeshift for these different actors, different degrees of experience, different preferences, different personalities. And it's that I realize, and I think actually some directors don't do that. They kind of stick to their way, and that's where, you know, from what I've heard and listened to, whether it's from actors or from you know, in interviews and stuff. Whereas what I've learned through a difficult process, of course, is, okay, hold on. You know, I think actors really, you can have a really great story, and then you don't have great actors. You can have really great, a really great story and not great actors. You can have really great actors and not a great story. The magic is when you have, of course, the combination of the two. But the fact is, no matter how good your story is, if you don't, have that talent from your actors, then that film's not going to be great at all, right? And so this appreciation and respect for those actors, I think, is really important, and the vulnerability actors have. Now, as directors and as filmmakers, we make ourselves hugely vulnerable when it comes to the release of the films as well, when it comes to everything. We pour our hearts and souls into it. And, it's like that Arabic saying, success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. So if a film does well, everyone, but if it doesn't go, it was the director. Or if, it was, and the film, and it's like, so, I'm not saying we are not vulnerable. Oh my God. I mean, but it's there on camera, and that vulnerability of, is huge. So anyway, so I've gone a bit too long on that, but so it was really incredible, working with all these different kinds of actors. And again, I'm doing my PhD at this point through film, through the actual experience of it. It's like I say, oh, okay, so the present was my undergrad, and because I didn't go to film school. This is how I'm learning. I'm learning on the job in a militarily occupied, colonized place of apartheid, as well as the trials and tribulations of independent cinema, and working with all kinds of actors. They say never work with children. Well, I've brought the children in, fire, rain, like what am I doing? But I'm learning, I'm growing, right? So back to then the other question you were talking about, shooting this film. For me, it's like the present was a walk in the park. Of course, I was on the ground for 3 weeks. Of course, the back and forth before that. It's a pretty simple story in that sense, and all. Whereas the teacher was a massive production, and so yes, problems, you name it, we had it. Any problem I think you've ever had on your film sets, we had it. It wasn't a morning where it was like, Farah, okay, we need to tell you. I'm like, no, next problem, putting out fires. And I guess you just have to expect that in independent cinema. So locations being lost, and of course money, and I don't know, all sorts of stuff. And then on top of that, you have the things that you kind of expected that come with this atmosphere and this reality of military occupation and colonization, and a place of apartheid, where you say, okay, checkpoints, roadblocks, they were there. We had delays, very, very frustrating. One weekend, actually, everyone went away, and I was kind of left in the village, as it were, and I'm working weekends, so that's totally fine. And they were all supposed to come back, and they weren't back for 4 days because the Israelis set up roadblocks, and that was that. So it was like, oh my God. And all I had was just visions of dollars floating in the air, because 2 lost days. We'd already had to scrap a few days anyway because we couldn't fit it in the budget, Yeah. I'm like, and I'm thinking the sets aren't even going to be ready, and I don't know, it was horrifying.
There's nothing more painful than losing bits of your story or performance or whatever it is, chunks of it, due to stuff that you can't control. It's one thing if you can say, well, I messed that up and I lost that moment, but when that happens, which is the loss of independent filmmakers, it feels.
Well, it's the bane of all our lives, but it could have been controlled had you had the money. It's like, it's timing. It's time. Yeah. Time is so precious. Yeah. And, the scenarios of the sun is setting, and if you don't do the thing now, the rest of the schedule for this final week, you can't. I'm like, oh God. But now let me throw in a whole bunch of other stuff, which I could do a whole podcast with you guys on. Really.
Well, we'll do a separate filmmaking.
No,
pain comparison.
I won't do it. No, because I was going to say that the I'm talking about related to occupation now, and scenarios, and you're like, but then there were some things that were related to just where you were beyond that as well. And some things I'm like, I won't even speak about because it's like, okay, and that involved,
Yeah.
this group of people having to show up and, lots of stuff went down. But now you get into the place that really affected me the most, which was I'm having to try do justice to the injustice that is unfolding around us in real time, that is in the story, the absurd, cruel things that take place in the story. But you're meeting people who are experiencing it, you're witnessing things, you're getting word of things happening, like finish the Kanafa scene that we've just shot in the heart of Nablus. And then, we worked till like 2 a.m, exhausted, we're overtime, miserable. I was the worst day of my life, actually, not my life, but and then of the shoot. And then I wake up at 6 a.m. and I'm reading messages saying the Israelis have just blown up a house that was like 2 kilometers away from where we were shooting 4 hours earlier. And you're like, okay, this is real. Or home being demolished. I mean, on my way to work, I pass a couple with their 6 children in front of the rubble of their home that has just been demolished about 2-3 hours earlier. And we've got, that's in our film, and these settlers and their violence and things that were parallel to what's going on in the film, and yet it's happening. And I knew it's happening. That's why it's written in the screenplay in the first place, right? I mean, but that kind of, it hits you hard, the responsibility of that, the importance of finishing this film, get it to the finish line. Don't let this get you down, because of course that could affect you, like just emotionally. Even the people you're working with, this is their life. I get to leave. The majority of the people working, the crew, the cast, the set, the people working with you, this is their lived reality, and the pressure of that, the mental, emotional toll of that. That's what I ended up finding the hardest. In all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we talked about filmmaking and activism, but worldwide, it feels at this moment that Palestinian oppression has certainly become more present for a lot more people. It feels like a lot of people are showing solidarity through protests and boycotts, despite whatever attempts we've just talked about with my social media to silence pro-Palestinian voices. What actions do you recommend for other activists and advocates who might not be filmmakers, looking to contribute in a meaningful way to the Palestinian cause?
I think the key word is be active. Okay, so again, this idea of solidarity not being it's a verb, it's a doing word, right? So it's active solidarity, and what that means is being active on so many fronts, how, when, and where you can, right? Again, coming back to this ala addi, to my size, to my capability, and really trying to assume, what I say is assume the responsibility of the privilege of your position. And all of us, in some way or another, outside of Palestine, are privileged. In some way or another. Like there is action to be done. So I'm always like, be active. So that means be vocal, be charitable. Join these protests, of course, but also be strategic in approaching things that you can. So let's say, whether you're a part of a union, whether you, here in the UK, we members of parliament that you can write to, but you can also start with like your councils. You're basically trying to call people to account at a time when we had this ICJ legal authoritative opinion in July. We're not talking about genocide. We're talking about the fact that they have unanimously declared the illegality of the occupation of the settlements and this system of apartheid, right? So now you have this kind of, I don't call it a weapon, but it is very much something to take to, whether it's in academia, whether it's culturally, whether it's in sports, in politics, in whatever it is, to say, look, we shouldn't be participating in this. So it could be a local council. We're saying like we're violating human rights, and call them to account. So now you're lower down in the chain of boycott, divestments, and sanctions, which to me is the main thing.
Agreed.
That is but people don't realize what's, there are angles to that. Sanctions, for example, is more government level, or, and that's where you can push. But when it comes to divestments, well, if you're working in a company, for example, you can use, there's, from a legal, if we continue to persevere in a way where we're using the politics, we're using the law. I mean, this Hind Rajab Foundation, fantastic initiative, fantastic initiative. So, where you can't physically do something necessarily, well, hold on, can you support the people who are financially? Everybody has a voice, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's the important thing to tell people, because people feel like, oh, what difference am I making? But in a world where the governments are ignoring international law, I think BDS and voting with your wallet, all of those things do make a difference, and they are having an impact on companies like Starbucks and Coke and all of these people who have settlement whatever businesses, if you like.
Yeah, no, and I think it's always about trying to for people to recognize the power of incrementalism, that 1 + 1 + 1, it all really adds up. And that's why, believe it or not, as much as the atrocities of this last year and a half are just beyond, I actually think to myself sometimes, well, had there not been this rapturous reaction and outrage, and and you say to yourself, well, what could be worse? And I know it's I mean, you look at Gaza now, and it's this apocalyptic reality, and you think, well, what could be worse? But here we are, where we have Trump talking about, like, literally ethnically cleansing everybody else who survived out, and all of this. But actually, I'll make a few points, because I'm writing a sort of a speech for a thing, and I've been making some points, so it's just helpful for this, just in terms of, like, this ending of Israeli impunity, right? Where I think, like, we talk about the mask being off, and so now when these statements are being made, you're having a collective kind of reaction that goes beyond the usual suspects, where even heads of states are having to be like, wait, hold on, like, this is going a step too far, or this is, or the pressure that is coming from various groups and organizations and human rights or initiatives and so forth. And I was writing down things about, yes, the global solidarity with Palestinians, the shift in the media consumption, just witnessing this idea of getting rid of TikTok, trying to ban TikTok, but that just shows you, like, how far it's come in terms of all the people who thought, oh, my posts and my likes and my didn't count for much. No, they did. We've got to keep going with these things. The legal action that's intensifying. If you can't do it, and you can't spearhead something like the Hind Rajab Foundation, you can certainly contribute to it, maybe financially, or even just share what they're doing. Things like that. The UN human rights efforts, but that's not on people. And then, of course, yes, this kind of boycotts and sanctions and the protests and really isolating Israel. They are a pariah state. What they're doing is just beyond. It's psychotic. It's psychotic.
Psychotic. And honestly, and as you said earlier, we, as whether Palestinians in the diaspora or anybody really living in the West, it's a privilege and it's our responsibility to speak out and to take action. Action is really key. It's not only about any action, as you outlined. But what's sad is that we are still talking about ethno-supremacy. It has no place in the 21st century. And for me, Zionism must be dismantled. And I think it's a matter of time before this happens. It's inevitable. It might take a bit longer, but it will happen. And solution-wise, I really believe in a single democratic decolonized state from the river to the sea, irrespective of religion, ethnicity, equal rights to all, justice, reparation, and the right of return of all Palestinians, which is really, as we know, recognized under international law. So I would love to know about your vision of a future Palestine, or a future for the Palestinians, and what steps do you really see that are needed to achieve this vision within our lifetime, not in 100 years or more?
I mean, I completely agree with your vision, what you've just described. I mean, that's what I believe in. I think that there was a time, a long, long time ago, that this idea of a two-state solution with reparations was a possibility, in the sense of it wouldn't have fully remedied the injustice, but it would have brought, maybe the violence to an end, and this military occupation, all of that. It wouldn't have dealt with, it wouldn't have been fair to the millions of refugees and all that, but it was a potential at some point. But we know that this sort of de facto expansion, there's a de facto apartheid state that exists because of the settler expansion and settlement expansion and all of this. So I think we're so beyond that, actually. And I agree with what you've said. And that's what I imagine and what I envisage. So I won't repeat it. And I would say that despite even this genocide, I mean, if, we look back in history and I say, okay, hold on, well, Rwanda as an example, but there was still room for rebuilding and reconciliation. We look at apartheid South Africa. And, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is doable and it is overcomable. I mean, you could even go as far as to say slavery in America, or the Holocaust in Germany. So anyone who says it's impossible, it can never, well, hold on, there are people living in Germany. There are Jewish people living in Germany today. In fact, in some ways, they've kind of, we can see what's happening in Germany. It's gone the complete other way. So it is doable. And so what is required? Look, I'm not a political or, analyst or somebody who could really tell you the stages. What I do know that it involves, for sure, outside pressure. It has to be forced. The dismantling of this colonial system. Israel has to abandon this ideological Zionist birth mother of settler colonialism, without question. But how is that going to happen? It's going to happen because the hand is forced, just like it was in South Africa, apartheid South Africa. It's not going to come from inside. They're not going to decide this suddenly and wake up. In many ways, they are in a psychological trap of cognitive dissonance, and they don't even know that they need a way out of that. They're so trapped. So from outside, and so it requires a lot of international involvement and pressure, and a lot of work, and a lot of psychological support. I've always said the solution to all of this is, okay, if we could get 30,000 psychologists to descend upon the land, yes, to help Palestinians, but it's for the Israelis, actually, in that sense. Yeah. Palestinians are constantly in the trauma and the attack. So at some point, Palestinians and all of this inherited trauma is going to need work. But right now, it's stop the killing, stop the occupation, stop the apartheid, stop. That needs to end, and then there can be a healing process. Whereas inside Israel, for Israelis, they're in a psychological trap. So I think a lot of psychological help, and I say this, having just actually come back from something where I've met with some top Jewish psychotherapists, and who feel strongly, in terms of like what Israel is doing to Palestinians is wrong. And these are people who want to do the work and are trying to do the work, where it just needs to be scaled. It needs scaling, because that's the problem. So anyway, I've gone off track here, but so I mean, I don't know the full process, but there is a way, and it requires the will of the international community to force it to happen, and it can happen, and it should happen. And unfortunately, you have the U.S. It quite literally is the U.S., which is Israel's partner in this whole process, which is driven by by greed, by whether it's the gas off the coast of Gaza, to business and surveillance and the weapons industry and the military industrial complex, and money In this case now for Gaza, even delusions of property, they all,
The Riviera.
yeah, but I mean, you look at Kushner and this whole they want land, they want property to get rich. I mean, it's
super colonialism and an oligarchy, but
yeah.
crazy.
No, of course. And what's happened in America, and this is what's so interesting because it is all connected, is Chris Hedges, he used this expression, it was wonderful, it's completely on point. He said, there has been a corporate coup d'etat in the US, and Trump is not, he's not the disease, he's the symptom. This has been happening for a while in America, and so it's a corporate oligarchy. It's a takeover of government by, on the one hand, that oligarchy, and then you've got this Christian evangelical crazies who are calling in the end of time. So that's unfortunately where they've got the stronghold on things. The rest of the world is really coming to that fore to say, oh my God, like this has to stop. This has to end.
Yeah, but honestly, Farah, I think what Gaza has exposed is really that it doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, Tory, Labor. It's the machine behind it. They really see the colony of Israel as sort of white Western people who are in the Middle East to protect their interests. So they don't even see us as equal or human. It's a very racist ideology, and it's so.
I think, absolutely. I think that's what's very interesting is not only has this exposed so much, but there is this kind of white colonial mindset that I think even some people who thought that they were progressive or on a it's exposed that it still very much exists, even with so many people who thought that it didn't exist with them or that they'd overcome this. So on a sort of the subconscious became conscious, if you get my meaning in that sense. And this idea that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Rome Convention and the statute and the Geneva Conventions, and it's selective. It's not universal.
It's very selective. And you're right. And Shamim and I, we've experienced that since this horrific genocide. A lot of our so-called European feminists, women's rights advocates, and so on, have all of a sudden they're Islamophobes or anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian. And we're like, hang on.
Or they're just silent. And
or
you're
they're
like,
silent, or they're just turning, and then, but it's like picking and choosing your ideology and your principles, and that's also been exposed, and I think it's really important. Whether it's the politics, the so-called liberals, the so-called crazy fundamentalists, and so on. It's all across, and the media and the press. So I think it's really important that we, the people, take action and make a difference.
But I would say that I think that there's a lot of people who are now shocked at their own complacency or their own racist reactions. And anyone who's mindful enough will start to look inwardly and be like, well, hold on, why have I been like this? I remember on the back of my interview for Hard Talk, I got so many emails from just random people, emails, DMs, social, and they were all like white, okay, by the names, by the, by the pictures, by whatever it was I was getting, or them telling me I am, a British white this, or I am an American, telling me and saying, actually it was a very interesting talk you had on Hard Talk. And some of them actually said, it made me realize my own racism. Why was it that I was able to be so empathetic towards Ukraine? Why was it I've been able, thank you for kind of pointing, like, it's very interesting that we've got to kind of almost give people time in some ways. And I know it's difficult because you say, well, we don't have time. The emergency and the death and destruction is happening in real time. But it's not easy for people to come to terms with their own prejudices that they didn't even realize they had till this moment, till this mirror was held up. I'm not saying everyone's going through that process. Some people are just completely indifferent, and but I think that a lot of people are also having this kind of like, wait a second, do I hold these prejudices, this racism, this feeling of white supremacy that I never imagined I did, but they're having to contend with it now. And some are shifting and starting to say, well, hold on, okay, that red line, or yes, I could feel that, back when, but clearly what's happening, it doesn't matter what I think of, you know, um, Jewish people or other issues around the world. For anyone with a conscience, you should be able to look at Gaza and just say, this is just wrong. Doesn't matter. It's just wrong. Beyond, like, just as a human being. And I think that I can definitely say to you that there has been and there is a shift at each stage of this past year and a half. And I think that's probably why it's culminated in that moment where it was like, oh crap, a ceasefire of some kind. And I think now it's very difficult, except that they're counting on us to be exhausted. It's very difficult for Netanyahu to push forward and Israel to push forward with this starvation process.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, every one of their ceasefires, so-called ceasefires, they've broken. They've done the first stage, and then they go on, and then, or they shift it to the West Bank, or they shift it to somewhere else. So it's which is what part of
yes, but I mean the full-fledged assault that they have been doing. I think it's come to I mean, we've got a man standing on Big Ben today, with the Palestinian flag refusing to come down. I don't know if you've seen on the media today.
No, I haven't.
And it's holding up traffic, and he's literally scaled up the side of Big Ben. And what I mean is, like, the disruption and the reaction of people. There's only so much,
No, thankfully, which is why we started, Shamim and I started this podcast as well, to build awareness, education, because a lot of people either couldn't understand or say it's too complicated. So we're trying to kind of showcase brilliant Palestinians or pro-Palestinian voices with different views and opinions, and to tell the story of Palestine through different lenses, if you like.
No, it's a beautiful initiative, and everyone, like, we discussed, everyone's trying to do what they can, how they can, in the way that they can, and I think that's the point. Is back to this idea of incrementalism. Is like everybody does their part, and there's an ecosystem that's created. And the one thing I can say to you is that, I try to remind people. I'm like, Gaza has been under a blockade for 17 years prior to 2023. That in and of itself is insane, right? Insane. But no one was lifting a finger. Very few people were lifting a finger. I think now the community and the people who are really, really, involved and have come together, it's unprecedented. It's very sad that, of course, it's been taking a genocide to get to that point where you have hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets and, in outrage, and for the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement to really scale in a way that it hadn't up until this point. So it really is tragic, and I really hope that it doesn't have any kind of dying out. The momentum needs to keep going. But that's the one thing that I'm happy about. I say is like, wow, it's really scaled, the solidarity, the movement, the law, the fact that we have a warrant out for Netanyahu. I mean, to me, this is huge. So, it might appear like, I mean, on the ground, it's never, ever been worse. But out in the court of world opinion, forget I want to call them leaders, the misleaders, and the governments that are malfunctioning, by the way, because the hypocrisy is so blatant, and but in the court of world opinion, amongst the masses, it's clear, and people are showing that they care, and I hope it's the beginning of the end of this decades-long oppressive reality.
I was going to ask you about a message for listeners and something they can take away from today's conversation, but I think you just summarized it very, very nicely. I don't know if you have anything else, Shamim, to add, or if we missed anything, Farah, that you'd like to add.
No, I think, we could talk and talk for hours. I would just say free Palestine. That's why, free
Inshallah.
Palestine.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful
Inshallah.
sentiment to end on, because when Palestine is free, everybody is free. So as we wrap up, I'll just say thank you if you're listening for joining us today. People-powered media is an alternative, a growing alternative, thankfully, to very controlled legacy media, controlled by the same financial interests and corporate interests that Farah was just mentioning. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like it, to share it, and most importantly, to subscribe. That kind of engagement really helps amplify this podcast and other voices that are dedicated to justice and humanism. Farah, really thank you for your insight, for the filmmaking stories, which I think we should do another podcast on in a different context sometime, and to your dedication to justice for Palestine and representation for its people. It really means a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just to add also, stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, and above all, as we said, take action. Collective power is the only way. And in solidarity, see you next time. And please do see Farah's films. You'll be moved by them. They're brilliant. And shukran again, Farah, for your voice, your tireless activism for Palestine. It's truly inspiring. Shukran.
Thank you. Thank you.